Hello everyone and welcome to the channel where I'm very interested to hear in the comments how this whole story looks from where you sit in the system, not in the headlines. Let's talk about the Dutch, a Chinese chipmaker, and how a caretaker minister managed to illustrate the real balance of power in the semiconductor chain better than any glossy EU strategy paper. Nexperia is not some glamorous AI unicorn. It makes boring legacy chips, the small components that sit inside cars, industrial systems, and everyday electronics. Its headquarters are in Nijmegen, its biggest packaging plant is in China, and its clients include European car makers who suddenly remember what just in time actually means when a container doesn't arrive. In other words, this is plumbing for the global economy. When plumbing fails, everyone notices quickly. In late September, The Hague decided to discover its inner strategic state. An obscure 1950s law about goods availability was suddenly pulled from the museum shelf and used to intervene directly in Nexperia's governance. Operations were effectively frozen. The Chinese CEO was pushed aside by a Dutch court on grounds of mismanagement, and the state gave itself power to block key decisions. Officially, this was about national security and fears that technology and production capacity would quietly migrate from Europe to China. Unofficially, the case was sold to the public with the kind of symbolism politicians love, a Chinese director buying himself a villa, which instantly became a moral exhibit A, no golden toilet, but enough marble to fuel the narrative. The problem is simple. When you freeze the operations of a chip supplier that feeds half the European auto sector, the other side also has levers. Beijing responded by blocking exports of Nexperia chips from China. So you had a nice little chain reaction, Dutch security theater at one end, Chinese export controls at the other, and Volkswagen somewhere in the middle calculating how many weeks of production it has before lines stop. If you're watching this from an industrial country, tell me in the comments, does this sound like risk management or self-harm dressed up as strategy? On paper, the Netherlands was defending European technology and preventing exfiltration of IP. In reality, you had a caretaker government after elections and before a new coalition performing sovereignty under heavy US pressure to get serious on China and chips. So they weaponized a law nobody had used for 70 years, froze a company that supplies their own industrial base, and then acted surprised when Beijing used its own leverage. China halted exports from the Chinese Nexperia plant, then partially relaxed after negotiations, but the signal was sent very clearly. If you politicize ownership, we can politicize flows. Fast forward to mid-November and suddenly the tone changes. The same interim minister, Vincent Caramans, announces that the state is suspending its special powers over Nexperia as a constructive step and a gesture of goodwill. The official line is that the company no longer shows the behavior that justified intervention. This is polite bureaucratic language for the blowback was more painful than expected. European car makers had already started warning about disruptions. China framed the Dutch move as a first step in the right direction, but also made it clear it wants full reversal, not half measures. The EU predictably called it stabilizing supply chains, which is Brussels speak for we nearly shot ourselves in the foot again, but stopped mid-trigger. Structurally, what do we see here? First, the European story about open economies, rule of law, predictable business environment collides head-on with the new security industrial reality. If a minister can dig up an old law and effectively nationalize control of a foreign-owned company based on signals and newspaper stories about a villa, then political risk in Europe just went up a notch. Add to that a court willing to sideline a CEO on broad mismanagement claims around hypothetical IP transfer, and you have a very flexible toolkit for corporate regime change. Useful in some cases, sure, but investors notice. Second, the West's attempt to ring-fence China out of higher-end tech collides with the fact that a lot of low-margin, high-volume industrial capacity lives there. It's very brave to talk about decoupling until a €5 chip halts a €50,000 car. Nexperia is exactly that zone. Not advanced AI accelerators, but old-school components that nobody wanted to localize while it was cheap, and suddenly became strategic when Washington discovered containment as a foreign policy hobby. Third, China showed it understands weaponized interdependence just as well as the US and EU. It didn't sanction the Netherlands in the abstract. It targeted flows from one plant that European industry actually depends on, then partially relaxed exports to show there is a dial, not just an on-off switch. That's a message to every capital that is tempted to copy the Dutch experiment. Be careful which node of the chain you decide to turn into a political battlefield. For the Netherlands, this ends in the usual European compromise: step back just enough to calm Beijing, reassure carmakers, and please Brussels, while pretending nothing fundamental has changed. In reality, something has. Boards of any strategic supplier now have to factor in that European states will happily dust off Cold War laws when Washington whistles, and then only later remember that they also need parts for their own factories. From a systems perspective, this is not about good guys and bad guys. It's about a triangle: US security pressure, Chinese industrial leverage, and European political theater, with real economy players trapped in between. The Nexperia saga simply made the geometry visible. I'm genuinely curious how this looks from your angle. If you work in industry, finance, or policy, do you see this as a necessary price for security, or as another way to bleed competitiveness while pretending to be tough? In any case, the next time someone in Europe talks about strategic autonomy, it might be worth quietly remembering that one medium-sized chip company was enough to trigger panic calls between The Hague, Beijing, and Brussels. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember: slogans don't power grids, systems do.